Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please continue with your breakfast. I'm Edward Jeredjian. I'm the founding director of the Baker Institute, and it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you here to Rice University and the Baker Institute this morning. We are very pleased to host this special visit by His Excellency Roy Ferguson, the Ambassador of New Zealand, to the United States. Our speaker represents an important and long-standing ally of the United States of America. New Zealand servicemen and women have fought alongside U.S. soldiers and sailors in every major conflict of the 20th century. In World War II, Americans and New Zealanders defended liberty in Europe and in the Pacific. Today, in Afghanistan, New Zealand's elite special forces serve together with American and NATO troops. For their efforts, they received the United States Presidential Unit Citation in 2004. New Zealand's armed forces also play a vital role in providing humanitarian relief and stability operations in the South Pacific. Since President Obama took office, bilateral relations have only grown closer. New Zealand has welcomed Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's recent announcement that the United States government will seek to ratify the South Pacific Nuclear-Free Zone, which bans the use, testing, possession, and stationing of nuclear weapons within the zone, as well as the dumping of radioactive waste. In addition, officials and scientists from both countries have met regularly to discuss global climate change issues. New Zealand is also a significant developed economy, as you know, within the economic powerhouse that the Asia-Pacific region has become. And as any Hollywood executive will tell you, the Lord of the Rings, trade has flourished between the U.S. and New Zealand. I understand, Mr. Ambassador, Lord of the Rings is the single most profitable film ever made. I'm not sure. The United States is one of New Zealand's top trading partners after New Zealand sent New Zealand's eternal sporting rival, Australia, and the People's Republic of China. What is more, under the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership, bilateral and regional trade may grow substantially to the benefit of both nations. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is the first multi-party free trade agreement linking Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific. Currently composed of Brunei, Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore, the expanded trade agreement would include the United States, Australia, Peru, and Vietnam. Our speaker has much more to say on this subject. Now it's my pleasure to turn the podium over to the President of Rice University, David Leebren, a native of Philadelphia. President Leebren is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. He served as Dean of Columbia University School of Law from 1996 to 2004 and became the 7th President of Rice on July 1st, 2004. President Leebren is an advocate of building strong ties between leading U.S. universities and their counterparts in Asia and the Pacific. We're happy to have him introduce our speaker this morning. David.
It's always puzzled me why the person making the introduction needs his own introduction, but thank you, Ed, anyway. It's my pleasure to add my welcome to all of you to Rice University and the Baker Institute. We're especially pleased to see some of our graduating seniors here. I wasn't really sure that 8 a.m. was a time on their alarm clock that they could set those alarms, and this may or may not be the first time in their 4-year career that they've actually come to an 8 a.m. event, but we're grateful that you are here. This event is a wonderful example of the continuing engagement of Rice with the City of Houston. Today's event has been sponsored by Rice University and the Baker Institute, but also by the Greater Houston Partnership. We have a number of representatives from the partnership with us today, including Senior Vice President for International Business, Cody Sutton. The partnership contributes immensely to our city and its progress, so I'd like to take a moment for all of us to thank the partnership both for sponsoring the breakfast and everything else they do for our city. We also, I believe, have some representatives from our Consular Corps We are immensely grateful to everything the Consular Corps contributes to our city. They are a vital part of our city. And of course, we want to extend an invitation to New Zealand to join that Consular Corps. Our speaker today is New Zealand's ambassador to the United States, His Excellency Roy Ferguson. Ambassador Ferguson began his appointment in February 2006. Previously, Ambassador Ferguson was director of the Americas Division in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade from 2002 to 2005, and was on the boards of the New Zealand United States Council, Fulbright New Zealand, the Ian Axford Fellowships, and the New Zealand Center for Latin American Studies. He lived in Washington previously as Deputy Chief of Mission between 1991 and 1995. Ambassador Ferguson served from 1999 to 2002 as New Zealand's ambassador to the Republic of Korea. In 2002, he concurrently became New Zealand's ambassador to the Democratic Republic of Korea. He has also served in Manila and Canberra. Ambassador Ferguson was educated at the University of Canterbury, where he received a master's in history and political science. He was awarded the Canterbury Fellowship and a Fulbright, which enabled him to study at the University of Pennsylvania. He graduated from Penn with an MA in International Relations. More recently, he completed the Advanced Management program at the Harvard Business School in 1998. Joining the ambassador on this trip is Consul General Paul Gestro, New Zealand Trade and Enterprises Director for East Americas and Consul General in New York. Today, Ambassador Ferguson will address the ongoing trade partnership between the United States and New Zealand. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Ferguson to Rice in Houston.
Ina mana, ina reo, ina hoe wha, tina koto, tina koto, tina koto katoa. President LeBron, Ambassador Deregian, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I greet you in Maori, the language of our indigenous people, and as is their custom, I greet you not once, not twice, but 3 times. It's really good to be back in Texas and a privilege for me to be at the James Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. This morning I wanted to talk a little bit about New Zealand-US relations and then focus on a new trade agreement called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we believe has enormous strategic potential in the Asia-Pacific region for not only New Zealand, but also for the United States and other countries in the region. Well, usually when I talk about the relationship between our 2 countries, I mention that it goes back to the sealers and whalers from New England who came to New Zealand actually at the end of the 18th century, long before we were a British colony, which happened in 1840. But here in Texas, I thought I'd tell you a sheep story, because in 1870, 3 businessmen from New Zealand, James Campbell, Edward George Godwin Austin, and A.B. Lagarde, decided to make their fortunes by establishing a sheep ranching operation in North America. So they incorporated in America as the New Zealand Sheep Company. And at that time, sheep raising on a commercial scale was largely unknown in the US, and the company's business plan was viewed as at best a gamble and at worst as crazy. And based on the information available to them at that time, they chose the region of West Texas as the most promising area for their operations. So arriving in California, they purchased 10,000 sheep from various suppliers. They then had to herd all 10,000 sheep overland to the high plains of Texas and New Mexico. There was no Panama Canal in those days. The journey took over a year and covered 1,300 miles, and this, of course, did nothing to persuade people that these Kiwis were not crazy. Well, they established their headquarters in a 2-story stone house that they built along Alamacitos Creek, about 60 miles from the present-day city of Amarillo. And after various ups and downs, by 1879 their flock numbered 100,000 sheep. 2 of them retired to Las Vegas to enjoy their earnings, but Campbell stayed on in Texas for the rest of his life and became manager of the iconic LX Ranch. Well, today Texas has 1.5 million sheep, not quite as many as New Zealand's 38 million, but enough to create a $100 million a year industry. All the legacy of 3 New Zealanders who history showed perhaps were not crazy, but rather inspired and determined. Well, while there were contacts such as these from time to time, it was really only in World War II that New Zealand and the US had intensive contacts at a people-to-people basis. Because New Zealand's troops, as Ambassador Durajan mentioned, were fighting in the Middle East, President Roosevelt actually agreed to send US troops to New Zealand to defend New Zealand. And so between June 1942 and the middle of 44, we had on average about 50,000 young Marines and young Army soldiers in New Zealand, either before or after they were going up to those terrible battles in the Pacific. And what made this encounter special, this friendly invasion as we like to call it, was that the 2 peoples were sufficiently similar to communicate, but sufficiently different to find each other intriguing. And I think when I look at our relationship today, what really underpins our relationship is that it is based on common values, the values of democracy, respect for the rule of law, and human rights. That doesn't mean we agree on every issue, but we do agree on these fundamental values. And as history has shown time and again in the 20th century against fascism and totalitarianism, and in this century against terrorism, we are prepared to stand up for those values and defend them if necessary. Our relationship has had its ups and downs over the years, and I guess the biggest down was in the mid-1980s when New Zealand was very concerned about nuclear weapons and nuclear testing, and we passed anti-nuclear legislation that has impeded interaction with the US Navy ever since. But whereas that disagreement cast quite a shadow over the relationship for many years, since 9/11, New Zealand and the United States have worked very closely together in Afghanistan, where we were proud to be the 3rd country after the United States and Great Britain to take over a provincial reconstruction team. And as Ambassador Durajan mentioned, we also have our special forces working in Afghanistan now. So the relationship has developed considerably over the past 5 to 6 years, and Secretary Condoleezza Rice, when she visited New Zealand at the end of 2008, described it as the best in a quarter of a century, and it's continued to strengthen under your new administration here and our new administration in New Zealand. Our elections were about 3 days after yours. And the strength of the relationship, I think, is shown by the very wide range of issues on which we work together. Everything from environmental issues such as Antarctica, where, of course, the US uses Christchurch in the South Island as the stepping off point to its base at McMurdo Station, and the New Zealand-based Scott base is right next door, through to fisheries interests where, for example, we have both just cooperated in drawing up a new fisheries management regime for the Southern Pacific, through to non-proliferation issues, New Zealand was delighted to be invited to the President's Nuclear Security Summit recently, and as we are neither a state with nuclear weapons nor a state with a nuclear industry, for us that was a considerable honour, and I think it reflected the fact that we have been such strong advocates for the vision of a world without nuclear weapons. And climate change is another area where we're working together closely, and in particular New Zealand took an initiative to the Copenhagen meeting last year on forming a global alliance for research into greenhouse gases from agriculture, which is often overlooked when people look at greenhouse gases. But if you want to bring developing countries into a solution for global warming, then it's going to be very important to look at ways of mitigating the effects of greenhouse gases from agriculture. And I'll be happy to talk about any of those topics later in question time. But let's turn to the economic relationship. For New Zealand, the United States is obviously a key economic partner. And while we can't pretend the opposite is true for New Zealand to the United States, nevertheless New Zealand is a good market and an easy place to invest for many US companies. We're very proud of the fact that we usually score first or second on the World Bank's ease of doing business survey. We're very high up in the economic freedom rankings as well. But I'd like to suggest to you this morning that we should be doing better. Until last year, the United States was our second biggest trading partner. It's now our third largest. China has taken over the second largest spot. And when you look at US exports to New Zealand, since 1990, they've grown on an average of 2% a year, which you might think is not too bad. But when you actually look at the share of New Zealand's imports that the US supplies, in 1990 that was 18%, and today it's 11%. And what I think is worrisome is that this is a common trend for US exports across Asia. This graph shows New Zealand-US trade. This shows the level of imports from the US for each year since 1990, the blue bars. The red line shows the share of New Zealand imports that the US is supplying. And this presents that material in a slightly different way, showing that in 1990 the US was supplying 17.8%. Today it's 10.8%, and you can see that a number of Asian countries have grown their share quite considerably. And if we look at 7 Asia-Pacific countries and US exports to those countries, you'll see it's a similar trend. This is actually graphing the aggregate imports from the US for China, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, as well as New Zealand. So why is this happening? Well, I think the first thing I'd have to say is there's obviously no single reason, but one reality that is disturbing to us is that the United States hasn't participated as vigorously as others in the network of free trade agreements that has developed in the region very rapidly since 1990. This is what we call the noodle bowl. This tries to present diagrammatically the free trade agreements that now exist between countries of the Asia Pacific, and you'll see that it's most intense on the western side of the Pacific amongst Asian countries. There are now, in fact, 175 free trade agreements in force that include Asia-Pacific countries, 20 agreements awaiting implementation, and another 50 being negotiated. Well, New Zealand's a committed free trader. Our number one priority would actually be to complete the Doha development round, because we believe that if you want to liberalise trade internationally, by far and away the most efficient and effective way is to do it multilaterally through the World Trade Organization. But unfortunately, in the absence of progress in the Doha round, New Zealand, like a number of other countries, has looked to other ways to liberalise trade, and so we've looked to do bilateral and sub-regional FTAs. And I'll just quickly show you what we have been doing over the last few years. We started in 1982 when we did a free trade agreement with Australia that even today is considered one of the most liberal free trade agreements in the world in terms of its comprehensiveness, the fact that it covers all goods and services. It also includes a free labour market between the two countries as free movement of people. And increasingly, we are now looking at ways we can integrate our regulatory systems and make doing business between Australia and New Zealand completely seamless. Well, then we started really negotiating in earnest with Asian countries in 2001 and did a free trade agreement with Singapore. I'm sorry, Singapore doesn't show up very well there, but it's the dot north of Australia and New Zealand. In 2005, we did a free trade agreement with Thailand. In 2005, we also did a very interesting agreement with Singapore, Chile and Brunei called the P4 or Pacific 4 Agreement. These are arguably four of the smallest and most open economies in the APEC region. That's the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Organization. And these countries decided in 2005, faced with this plethora of FTAs that was being developed around the region, to actually try to do an FTA that was a little bit different. First of all, this is a free trade agreement that is of high quality, and by high quality I mean it's comprehensive. It doesn't exclude sectors because they're sensitive politically for one of the partners. In some cases it has phasing in periods to cope with sensitivities, but it is comprehensive in terms of its coverage. It's high quality in terms of its protection of things like intellectual property rights. And most importantly, and this is what really distinguishes it from other free trade agreements, it has an open accession clause. So these four countries were really saying to the other members of APEC, hey guys, if you want to liberalise trade, we're sort of setting a bit of an example here and we'd invite any of you to join us. In terms of New Zealand's FTAs, the next thing that happened for us was we negotiated a free trade agreement with China. We were the first developed country to do that, and for New Zealand, it's actually a very good agreement. By 2016, which was 12 years after we completed it, we will actually have free trade in 97% of our exports with China. And given that we supply a lot of agricultural goods to China, that's very important for New Zealand. In 2009, together with Australia, we negotiated a free trade agreement with all the members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and we've also concluded negotiations with the Gulf Cooperation Council. Well, having issued this invitation as the P4, we were really delighted when the administration said that it would like to join the negotiations. And as soon as the United States indicated it would like to join in negotiations with the P4, Australia, Peru and Vietnam said they would also. So we now have a P8, which has been renamed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we are working on that agreement at present. Why have a TPP? As I mentioned earlier, because we want to set good standards consistent with the WTO for trading across the Asia-Pacific region. We want to have an open accession clause, and we want to build free trade architecture in the Asia-Pacific region. So we don't see the TPP as ending with the 8 members who are currently negotiating. To the contrary, we would like to think that this will create a snowball effect and that we will get other countries wanting to join this agreement to the point where it eventually becomes the new economic architecture for trade in the Asia-Pacific region. Why do I think it's important for the United States? I think for strategic as well as economic reasons. The US has been the guarantor of peace and security in the Asia-Pacific region for over half a century, and New Zealand, for its part, certainly wants it as part of any future economic architecture. And we also think that this will be a real contribution to the administration's export drive and its goal of doubling exports in the next 5 years. Where are we at in terms of the negotiations? We had the first round in Melbourne in March. There'll be a further round in San Francisco in June. There are two other rounds beyond that scheduled for this year. We would hope that we might be able to conclude an agreement by the end of next year, which is a fairly obvious point in political terms, given that the United States is the host of APEC, and the APEC leaders meeting will be held in Honolulu in November next year. Now, we realise that is a very ambitious agenda, but we do think it's doable. And perhaps I should just conclude by reminding you that we are those crazy visionaries who started your sheep industry. So we hope we can get there. So I'd be very happy to answer any questions that anyone might have on either on the TPP or any other aspect of our relationship.
Thank you, Ambassador. Please just raise your hands and identify yourself, and the floor is yours. Okay. That's right. A microphone will be brought to you.
Hi, my name is Randall Hall. I'm with Rice University. I read one analysis of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that identified as the sensitive sectors for the U.S. the dairy, textile, and sugar industries. And I wonder if that analysis was correct, and if you could comment on how large an obstacle you believe those sectors might be.
Yes, I think that is an accurate analysis, and I mean, perhaps I could just say a few words about dairy, as New Zealand doesn't produce sugar or textiles, so those sensitivities are actually with other members of the TPP. I mean, I think in any trade agreement, and particularly any trade agreement that is seriously attempting to liberalise trade, there'll be sensitive sectors for every member of the trade agreement. And, you know, for New Zealand, we have sensitivities on some aspects of intellectual property, because we're a net importer of intellectual property on pharmaceuticals and other aspects like that. So there will be give and take all around. Just on dairy, though, I think it's probably fair to say that we have a slightly different view of the international dairy industry than some US dairy producers. We see enormous promise in terms of dairy internationally. Dairy is actually the most protected area of agricultural trade, and New Zealand, as we aren't actually a large producer of dairy products in absolute terms. I mean, we produce about the same amount of dairy products as California, or about 9% of total US dairy production, but we are a large exporter because we only have 4.3 million people and we can't eat all the dairy products we produce. But we have seen double-digit growth in dairy demand from Asia, I mean particularly China and India in recent years. Even though China has a burgeoning dairy industry, we don't believe there's any way they will be able to supply their own needs. And so we think the issue in dairy looking forward is actually going to be one of finding supply for the demand there will be, rather than the problem that has existed in the past where you've had dairy surpluses in the EU and the US, which has tended to depress prices. And when you look at where that demand might come from, we think there's potentially three areas in the world. I mean, New Zealand and Australia are both dairy exporters, but we don't have much more land we can put into pastoral agriculture. We've converted, in fact, a lot of our beef farms to dairy because prices have been better on dairy over recent years. So we think the dairy demand will be met by three areas. South America is growing its dairy industry very rapidly. Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay. The Ukraine is potentially another large source of supply. They've got good conditions there for pastoral agriculture. And the third area is the United States. And last year, for the first time, the United States actually exported more dairy product than it imported. And we actually think that the future for the US dairy industry is one of export, but I'm not sure that vision is shared entirely by the US dairy industry yet. I mean, there are a number of your big dairy cooperatives that are exporting a lot of product, but your dairy industry is still a very diverse one. You know, everything from a small farmer up in Vermont with a couple of cows in a barn through to very large dairy farms in California and elsewhere that have thousands of head of dairy cows. So I think that although the dairy sector is a sensitive one, I don't think that when we look ahead and look to the future, that it's one that should be, a hurdle to reaching an agreement, because I actually think that the future for US dairy is in export, and if that's the case, you have as great an interest as New Zealand in breaking down the barriers to dairy trade internationally, and particularly in Asia where the growing demand is.
Hello, I'm interested on New Zealand's position on the whaling that's going on.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, New Zealand, I mentioned that our very first people-to-people contacts were actually those whalers and sealers from New England. And of course, we were part of the exploitation of whales right through until it may have been the 1960s, when, like the United States and a number of other countries, we realized that we were on the verge of making extinct a number of varieties of whales. So we have been a strongly conservationist country on whaling ever since. What we're faced with at the moment is, internationally, the organisation that has jurisdiction over whales is the International Whaling Commission. This was actually a commission set up to regulate the whaling industry in the same way that you would regulate a fisheries. The difficulty is that a number of members of the International Whaling Commission, including New Zealand, actually want to see total conservation of whales. There are a number of other members, notably Japan, Norway and Iceland, who want to exploit whales and who currently are taking whales under the guise of scientific whaling. And at the moment, we've had a stalemate in this organisation for many years, and this issue has actually been quite a serious irritant in, our bilateral relations with Japan, which otherwise are extremely good, as well as other countries' relations with the whaling countries. So at the moment, there is a diplomatic effort to see if we can find a compromise. I mean, there are a number of whales that are being killed each year at the moment under the heading of scientific whaling, and I think the diplomatic effort is to see whether we can actually get on a path to reducing the total number of whales that are killed. Now, whether we're going to be able to find a compromise, I don't know. This is a very sensitive subject domestically, both in Japan and New Zealand, Australia, and I think here in the US as well as other countries. Does that answer your question?
Good morning, Ambassador. How are you doing? So I'm a sociology student here at Rice University, and I had a question for you more related to associating education with economic development. Probably because of where I am in my life, I immediately associate the economic development between two countries with the intellectual development of the two. So with that said, when I think New Zealand, immediately in my head what pops up is kiwi, sheep, and beautiful landscapes, but I don't think more about the intellectual side of what your research institutions do. And I was wondering, if you could, how would you reshape that stereotype to further intellectualize it so that there is an idea of intellectual development between the two countries and undergraduate and graduate students between the two?
No, look, thank you very much for that question, because I have Paul Gestro with me, our Consul General from New York, and New Zealand Trade and Enterprise spend a good deal of their time here in the United States promoting New Zealand's niche manufacturing, our IT industries, and indeed we spend a good deal of time working on our science and technology relationship. There is a lot of exciting work in the science area happening in New Zealand. Traditionally, I guess our strength in science has come from our agricultural base, but that that today is very broad. In terms of the work that is being done, you may be interested to know that the National Science Foundation actually keeps a tally of any grant that it gives that involves a researcher from a foreign country. It keeps a note, and they have given more grants with researchers from New Zealand than any other country, I learnt from the director of the NSF a few weeks ago, which I think is a sign of both how New Zealanders like to be world class in whatever they do, so they like to align themselves with with researchers they perceive to be at the cutting edge, but also how I think New Zealand adds value in the science area. We have a number of niche areas of expertise. Earthquake engineering is one, because we are on the other side of the rim of fire that California is on and are subject to earthquakes, so we've done very sophisticated work in there. We've done actually sophisticated work in materials research too, which you might not necessarily expect from New Zealand. So there's a whole range of areas, and I would encourage all of you under the age of 30 to go on our website and check out our working holiday scheme visa, which enables anyone between 18 and 30 who is a US citizen to go to New Zealand for up to a year to study, work and be a tourist all on the same visa, which we have found a great way to get more interaction between our young people and Americans. We have a lot of New Zealanders who come to the US for study, mainly postgraduate actually. They tend to do their undergraduate in New Zealand and come to the US for masters or doctorates. There's a wide range of areas. Environmental science is another area where we like to think we do world-leading research.
Ambassador, thank you for coming to the Baker Institute. You mentioned the agriculture, the dairy in particular, and I assume that the beef industry is very important to New Zealand as it is in Australia. In this country, there is almost a radical movement against industrial farming, where the cattle are fed on corn, primarily on corn. They're genetically altered to be able to digest the corn. They're given lots of hormones. They're fed on grains. They're grown with pesticides and herbicides. And there's a reaction in the popular press, lots of books out there that talks about a farming technique or a raising of beef cattle and dairy cattle that I think actually originated in New Zealand, where the cattle are not genetically altered and where they're raised on grasses and they're rotated through grasses. Is this a part of the beef and dairy industry that New Zealand can help bring to the rest of the world?
Well, thank you. I'm not sure that that pastoral agriculture actually originated in New Zealand. I suspect we got it from England originally, but certainly we have put a great deal of intellectual effort into developing pastoral agriculture, and the effort really goes into genetics of the animals, breeding animals that are the most efficient in terms of eating grass and either producing milk or becoming heavier if you're looking at beef cattle. And the other area where a lot of effort goes into is developing the right sort of pasture for the particular climate, depending on the rainfall and the sunshine and those sorts of things. I mean, we are blessed in New Zealand in that we have a temperate climate, so while we get some snow in the winter, we can keep our animals outdoors all winter. Most farmers would have a month or two in the middle of winter where they would have to feed the farmers hay or silage that they had produced on the farm. But for us, I mean, pastoral agriculture is actually the most efficient way of doing it, because we aren't big grain. We're not a big grain producing country. And it is interesting how I've noticed that pastoral agriculture is, I guess, making a resurgence in the United States, and a number of New Zealand farmers have actually come over to places like Missouri and Georgia, where the climate is amenable to pastoral agriculture, and are starting to farm in that way. And of course, as they farm in that way, American farmers sort of see what's the way they're doing it, and so it's starting a bit of a trend there. I think there's still a distinction between organic farming and pastoral farming, because our farmers, don't use they don't use hormones at all, but I mean they would still use antibiotics if an animal got sick, but under very careful supervision. And there's yet another stage when you go to organic farming where you don't use any antibiotics or any pesticides on the pasture or anything of that sort.
Good morning, Ambassador. I'm Anthony Chan at Rice University. I've been reading recently about a new focus on science, technology and research in New Zealand in articles in the New Zealand Herald. I wonder if you could comment on that initiative and perhaps on its implications for the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Certainly. Well, our current government is putting a renewed emphasis on science and technology, and for the first time ever we've had Sir Peter Gluckman has been appointed the Prime Minister's Science Advisor. So I think, I mean, in the United States, you've had a science advisor to the President for many, many years. We didn't have this position in New Zealand. The percentage of our GMP we spend on research and development isn't as high as it should be, we believe, and so we're trying to get that up because we see it as such a key to economic development going forward. And we're also looking at merging. We've had a system where we've had a Ministry of Research, Science and Technology, and then we've had a separate foundation which has been the funding organisation, the funding arm of the government, and we're actually going to merge those two government agencies, and we think we'll get some synergies from that. We had earlier this year a meeting under our bilateral science and technology agreement with the US, and we had about 30 senior US administrators and scientists, including the director of the National Science Foundation and the State Department's chief science advisor in New Zealand, and that was a very good meeting and actually identified 6 key areas for focus in research between the two countries. So to the extent that the two governments have any influence over research, and we only want to do this in a positive sort of way, we don't want to be directing people what they should do, but to the extent that we do have any influence, we're sort of focusing on those 6 areas and conducting a number of workshops to bring people together in those 6 areas.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for coming to Houston. In your opening comments, you expressed support for but concern about the Doha negotiations since they've been stymied for some time. New Zealand's played a very important leadership role in those negotiations, chairing some of the key committees. Would you have some comments on how you would assess, in a broad brush, how we might move these negotiations forward now?
Sometimes when I'm feeling really optimistic, I think back to the Uruguay round, and when the Uruguay round got a little bit stalled in 93, I think it was, 94, and I know you know this better than I do. That was about the same time that the APEC countries announced the Bogor goals at the leaders' meeting in Indonesia, and the APEC countries announced that they were going to move forward and have free trade amongst the developed members of APEC by 2010, and including all the developing members by 2020. Now, unfortunately, APEC hasn't reached that goal, but at the time, the notion that the United States in particular had an option other than the World Trade Organization for pursuing trade liberalization, that competitive instinct worked very constructively to actually persuade countries in the Uruguay round to look again and to negotiate again a little more seriously, and we subsequently had the conclusion of the Uruguay round a year or so later. And sometimes when I'm feeling very optimistic, I think, well, if we could get TPP underway and actually get good momentum going, I mean, ideally an agreement by the end of next year, but at least some signs that this was a very serious negotiation, then that might serve to actually light a fire under Doha, because I think Doha is stalled at the moment. Everybody is stalled on their position. We need some of the larger developing countries to move on market access. I mean, the truth is we probably all need to move a little bit off our set positions if we're going to get an outcome. But there's no doubt in our minds that if we get an outcome, I mean, this will be another stimulus package for the world economy, and it's a stimulus package that none of our taxpayers have to fund. So we think it's very important. We are continuing to work as hard as we can in Geneva. Actually, our ambassador there still chairs the agricultural section of the talks. And so we will do everything we possibly can to get Doha moving. But I think that, the reality is that it's not much is likely to happen this year because of the political calendar in the United States, but we will have another opportunity next year, and hopefully TPP might create a little constructive tension and persuade people to go back to Doha, and that it is worth completing the Doha round.
Good morning, Ambassador. My name is Heather Mattingly. I'm a business graduate student at the Jones School, just across the way here at Rice. And thank you for shedding light on all of these opportunities. These are exciting opportunities in the Pacific. Could you illustrate more specifically what New Zealand is looking to achieve in the midterm in the next 10 to 20 years? You can answer the question however way you wish, whether it be GDP growth, import, export, etc., and what problems New Zealand is hoping to overcome.
Yes. Well, our national goal is actually quite simply to raise our GMP per capita. We have slipped, particularly in relation to Australia. I mean, that's in part because the Australian economy has done, so well over the last 15 years. And the big challenge we face in New Zealand is not dissimilar from the sort of challenges I see when I visit particularly Midwestern states, and that's a talent drain. I mean, New Zealanders have built into their DNA what we call OE, or overseas experience. So every young New Zealander, as I mentioned earlier, usually when they finish university, wants to travel, and a lot of these young New Zealanders travel traditionally to the United Kingdom because it was easier for them to get visas to work there, but increasingly to the United States, to China, to Asia. And they find it relatively easy to work for multilateral companies. And our challenge as a government is to actually attract them back to New Zealand by, creating the sort of opportunities that they will find appealing. And we're having some success in this. As Ambassador de Regent mentioned in his introductory remarks, Lord of the Rings has been a huge success for New Zealand in terms of tourism, because it's made a lot of people intrigued about the scenery and want to come and see the scenery. But the greatest impact that Lord of the Rings has had is that we now have a world-class special effects studio in Wellington. And that studio, we actually have quite an expat American community there who've come to work at that studio because it is so advanced. I mean, all the special effects from Avatar, the movie, were done in Wellington. And I often say to people there have been two great technological revolutions that have impacted on New Zealand. The first was refrigerated shipping in the 1880s, which meant we could send all our lamb and butter to the UK market. The second is broadband internet, because that really reduces the tyranny of distance for New Zealand. So our goals, I guess, are not that dissimilar from many US cities and states, and that is we want to build our economy, but we realise we're in a globalised world. There's a competition for talent. We can't compete for some jobs because we simply aren't willing to reduce the price of labour to that of some of our neighbours. So we have to keep on moving up the value chain, and that means ensuring that our education system remains sound, that we put enough money into scientific research and development, and that we create opportunities to attract some of those young Kiwis and also others back to New Zealand, because we are an immigrant receiving country. Thank you.